And now we come to windows. As I said, Chartres possesses some of the most spectacular windows in the world. And this one is called the Notre Dame de Belle Verrière, and Verrière is a canopy. We don't know where the name came from and why she's called that. But she was actually part of the Romanesque Cathedral and then reused, and it's often that windows have been reused. The original part is only those three squares, the central squares. That's the original part of the image, and then everything around the window was added in the 13th century, but the original three squares do come from the 12th century. And you can read here when you get your PowerPoint everything that I just told you. It is the throne of the Holy Wisdom, as we had seen on the southern tympana. And it is done in the original blue of Chartres, which was extremely beautiful and also extremely expensive because it was done from cobalt mineral, and that came from Afghanistan, so it was expensive. The window itself had been regarded by the worshippers as holy in itself, and a lamp had always been placed in front of the window. And here is just a description of what the panels are. Another spectacular window is the north rose right here, and it consists of this very large rose, lancets on each side, and then 5 lancets underneath. In the center there is the Virgin Mary with the child Christ. She's holding the baby Jesus. She's surrounded by 4 doves and various angels. Then the 12 major prophets encircle them in diamond-shaped windows right here. And then there are 12 lunettes around that contain 12 minor prophets. Then on each side, these lancets contain the symbols of Blanche of Castile, who was the mother of Saint Louis, and she came from Castile. So her symbol is a castle on the red background, and then the fleur de lis is a French symbol, and thus you have both the castle and the fleur de lis. This just describes the same thing to you, what's where. And then here are the various angels, and here you see the major prophets, and you in fact can read their names. In the quatrefoils are the lilies of France. And then in the larger lunettes, right here, from left to right, you see here King Melchizedek above Nebuchadnezzar, and then King David holding a harp above Saul, Virgin Mary in the arms of Saint Anne with the French royal coat of arms, and then King Solomon above Jeroboam right there, and the high priest Aaron above the Pharaoh. And here they all are, and again the names could in fact be read. And here it says Melchizedek, David, Saint Anne, Solomon, and Aaron, and also the lower figures also can be read. They're just very, very beautiful. The windows also show labors of the month, the astrological signs, the zodiac signs. As I said, the entire knowledge of Christendom at that time is exhibited in that cathedral, and exhibited in a Gothic cathedral, in the developed Gothic cathedral in general. And you can see how the portal developed. These are the 13th century portals, much, much deeper than the royal portal. And we also can see the difference in sculpture. This is 12th century sculpture, as I said, very elongated. On the other hand, the sculpture on the south portal is beginning to move, is beginning to separate itself from the column and is acquiring life. You can almost see sort of a classical S-curve in the figure here, which is helped, of course, by his belt. And as you see, the royal portal is not nearly as deep as the other two portals. In Amiens Cathedral, the design of the nave really reached its pinnacle. And as you see here, the design of the western entrance is also becoming all the more lace-like. Here is an old picture of Amiens taken from the flight of a bird. And you can see how it just dominates the entire town. Here are the flying buttresses, and they're just lovely and beautiful. And you can see the entire scheme of supports on them. And even the pinnacle itself kind of serves as a nail, sort of a nail that's driven into the buttress for better stability. Here the colonnades go all the way up. As you see, it's the same thing. The gallery is not there anymore, just the triforium, and it's becoming taller and taller, and the clerestory windows are becoming larger and larger. And here too, not a large transept because it's in the middle of the town, as you see, four-partite division in the vaulting, and the lines, it's all vertical. Everything is directed towards verticality. And you can see it here as well, the same point of view as we saw in Chartres. This is a painting of Amiens. It's a painting of the choir, and you can see how spectacular it is, and how these ribs, in fact, they are like fins on a fish. They almost overlap the windows. And here's a nice schematic that shows you this is Laon, which is about 80 feet. And here is Paris, which is 107. Then Chartres, 118. And then Amiens is now reaching 144 feet, so it's going higher and higher. And you also can see the elevation, and how the elevation is changing from one to the other. One of the most beautiful, and for some people, the most beautiful Gothic cathedral is the Cathedral of Reims. The basic structure with kind of the square towers is that of Paris, but it is just a completely lace-made cathedral. Everything flickers. The eye cannot rest on any monolithic stone. And everything tends to be vertical. Even the row of the kings and queens is now placed up above, and even that is so tall that it looks vertical. And here you have Reims and Paris. As you see, the basic structure is the same, but in the Reims one can in fact see through the windows. One can see the flying buttresses from the outside. The tympana now receive rose windows instead of sculpture, and the sculpture now is relegated to the gables on top of the tympana. Here's just another painting of the cathedral because it's so beautiful. The inside of Reims, four-partite vaults, and here it is. The transept is the same width as the choir, and a very, very long nave. And you can see by the crossbars that the four-partite element. And still another photograph of everything tending upwards. And what you see then is what will be called a bar tracery, when all the lancets have now joined together to form bar tracery. And here are the stained glass windows. The tallest of them all will be the cathedral in Beauvais, and that will reach almost 160 feet. Amiens is 138. So tall was it, and well, it collapsed. The only part of it that remained is the choir and the apse. The nave collapsed and just was not rebuilt. And here you can see the chevet from here, and here's the interior, which is spectacular. And here the comparative heights. Laon, Paris, Chartres, Amiens 138, Beauvais 157.5. And you can see what's happened to the naval arcade. And you are sort of in a forest, in a very beautifully lit, sunlit forest here. And all the elements tend to go upwards, all the architectural elements, and then meet there and come down. Here's still another image. Now here's Laon, which is 80 feet. It could essentially fit into the naval arcade of Beauvais Cathedral. It's half the size. And thus Reims Cathedral, and we now go to the sculpture in Reims Cathedral. And some of the sculptures here, it's called Annunciation and Visitation. This is the Annunciation, when the angel appears to the Virgin Mary and incarnation happens. And this is Visitation, where Mary, pregnant with Jesus Christ, and Anne, pregnant with John the Baptist. Anne is considerably older than Mary. They visit one another. And all the sculptures have clearly been done by different sculptors. In other words, so these two perhaps by the same, who was looking at classical sculpture, at sculpture. Perhaps the man went to Rome. Perhaps the man just saw some Roman sarcophagi with similar sculpture, because the garments that the women wear, their attitude, their look, one looks like an elderly matron, and one looks like a young Roman matron. So, and they are completely separated now. Unlike Chartres, remember, very columnal sculptures. These are individual sculptures just attached to the columns. And these two are delightful, also done by two different sculptors. In fact, because the sculptures on Reims Cathedral have been moved from place to place, it seems the angel was positioned there later. But whoever did Mary, the face is larger, the clothes just fall very straightforwardly down, whereas there's a lot more, well, a lot more expression in the angel's face, as he is clearly enjoying talking to Mary. This is the Annunciation, two different artists, Virgin Mary, about early 13th century, and the angel perhaps a bit later, and he was moved from the north portal. The epitome of high Gothic in the sense of graceful curve and drapery. So these sculptures differ now considerably from the early sculptures of Chartres. And he in fact is called the Smiling Angel by the French, and he is much beloved by the French. And here's still another photograph. You see here, much of it is destroyed because of the wars. Reims was very badly destroyed, but it's been renovated, and it's probably all been renovated by now. The Knights' Communion, we'll be looking at these two right here. We don't know exactly who the figures are. Maybe Melchizedek and Abraham. Maybe just a priest sending off a knight on his crusade. Here you have them, and these now are sculptures in the round. They're not attached to anything, they're actually placed in the niches. And here is a priest who is offering the knight his communion before the knight goes off on a crusade. So you see the extraordinary progression within 100 years in sculpture. This is now high Gothic, this is mature Gothic. And Into the 14th century, we see the Virgin of Paris right here, and there's a definite similarity, in fact, to the classical sculpture of Greece. This is a 4th century BC sculpture by Praxiteles that shows that S-curve that I had mentioned, and shows the counter posture of every limb, of every sinew. And the same is done with Mary, even though she is covered with her abundant robe. But the fact that all the weight is placed on one leg while the other leg is free, and the same thing is held true here as well. Here's the Sainte-Chapelle, and that's the little building that Saint Louis IX built for his relics. It is a jewelry box. It's an architectural jewelry box. It sits in the middle of the courtyard of what used to be a royal palace. Today is the French judiciary. And here it is. One, in fact, walks inside through the palace. Well, one can walk from the outside, but often one is sent around the palace to go in. And this just gives you a short history of the relics and how St. Louis purchased them. This is the Latin Empire, which came into existence after 1204, after the Fourth Crusade, when the Western Christians sacked Constantinople, established the Eastern Empire. It only existed for less than 60 years, and the last so-called Eastern Emperor, Western Eastern Emperor, was so poor he began to sell relics, the most valuable relics, and that's how St. Louis got those relics. And this gives you the whole story of how they came to Paris. One of the relics was the crown of thorns that was said to be the true crown of thorns, and it is kept here. It stayed in Sainte-Chapelle until the French Revolution. Then after the Revolution it went to the library. Fortunately they did not destroy it, but then after Napoleon reached the concordat with the Vatican, they were returned to the church, and they were in Notre Dame, but before the fire, but they were saved by the fire brigade. And here's the inside of Sainte-Chapelle, because it was a very small building, and because the builders by now had great experience. No flying buttresses were needed, no supports were needed, and the walls are essentially glass. It truly is a glass reliquary, and it's very, very beautiful. And it's not obviously very tall. It's not a high-rise. It's not a skyscraper like Beauvais, but its windows next to Chartres are the most extraordinary windows. So here, and again, the four-partite division. There are no side aisles. It's just one space. And here's still another photograph. This is a crypt, somewhat over-restored, but beautiful nonetheless. And thus we arrive at the last stage of Gothic, the flamboyant Gothic, literally flamboyant, because the high Gothic is called rayonnant, in other words, radiating Gothic, and that comes from the window itself, from the rose window, because the rays radiate from the center. Here, however, what we see are flames, and that's why it's called flamboyant. And probably the best example of this sort of Gothic is in the north, in Rouen, in France, and you can see through it. And the North Tower of Chartres is also done in that same style. It is the front is convex right there. There's a triple entry, but there are also two more arches on the sides, which are blind entries. And here you can see it in light, and you can see how lace-like the building is. And now we go to England. Here's one of the cathedrals, St. Albans Cathedral, and you can immediately see that the English taste, they retained the solid mural construction. The English cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals, will essentially be Romanesque. They'll be earthbound and sprawling. They will love line in their decoration, but they will take the Gothic elements, the mullioned windows, the pointed arches, they'll take all that, but they will not soar upwards because they felt no need to do so, except sometimes with the towers. Here is St. Albans. It has a triple entry that indicate the nave and the side aisles. However, much more of a screen facade, and the great window here that lights up the nave. The tower is still a Norman tower, and it's actually a fascinating building because the left wall still features a mix of Norman arches that go back to the 11th century, whereas the arches on the south wall, as you see, exhibit the Gothic elements, and the ceiling is a wooden ceiling. So as I said, England just took the Gothic elements and ran with it. Here's St. Mary Dewar Church in West Sussex, and again the central tower is a Norman tower, and it kind of straddles the end of the Romanesque architectural era and the beginning of Gothic, because as you see on the facade even, you see Romanesque windows at the bottom, Gothic windows at the top, and there's even a rose window. All these churches were rebuilt many times, and as they were rebuilt in later times, they were rebuilt in Gothic. Here is the interior of the same church, the original interior before being rebuilt. And here's the interior, the new one, the newer one, when it was rebuilt with Gothic elements. Whereas in St. Albans, they did not bother to rebuild both sides, they just rebuilt one. And now we go to Canterbury Cathedral. Here's London, here's Canterbury Cathedral. Right here. And it became a very famous place of pilgrimage because here at the end of the 12th century, there was murdered Thomas Becket by the knights of King Henry II. They were friends at first, but then they disagreed on the importance of church versus monarchy. And then Henry II caused for Thomas Becket to be murdered, and as a result of which the church became a pilgrimage church, and brought both the need to expand the cathedral and also the money to do so. And here we have it. It's very different from the French cathedrals. The English cathedrals will not tend to go upwards, but they will be very extensive. This is done in the so-called transitional Gothic style, the English transitional Gothic. And here are the columns and the six-partite vault. The gallery is in place, and so is the clerestory right here. The rebuilding of the cathedral included a further eastward extension to replace the original chapel and just to make it much, much larger. This Salisbury Cathedral is again very large, and perhaps because of Cluny it has two transepts, because Cluny III, if you remember, had two transepts. You can see it here. It has rectilinear apse right there. The cathedral itself was built in a relatively short time, but the spire was added later, and it's a very famous spire. It's a very tall spire. It has a cloister, as you see here. There's a baptistry. And John Constable painted it a number of times because he lived nearby, and he made Salisbury very famous with his paintings. Now, the facade of the Salisbury is a screen, which really doesn't tell us what's going on. When you compare it with Reims, for instance, you see the difference, and the English really embraced screen facades. You remember the French Notre Dame la Grande, the early 12th century facade in France, and then I talked about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who came to England from France and brought a lot of stylistic innovations with her. And here are the two facades. This was done in the early 12th century, and this was done a century later. Salisbury has the tallest spire. It houses the best preserved of the 4 surviving original Magna Cartas. Has the oldest working clock in England, dating from the end of the 14th century. Has the largest cathedral cloisters. It's also the largest cathedral in England. The choir stalls are the largest and the earliest complete set in Britain. The vault is the highest in Britain. So the whole cathedral is bigger, better, best, and built in 38 years, which is astonishing. The spire was built later. What we see in the interior of the Salisbury Cathedral is the appearance of this webbing, which ultimately will become the fan vaults. And the English will always love it. And it's also possible that the Hiberno-Saxon tradition that certainly pertains to England played a role in that. Here are the fan vaults in the chapter house, and here is the barrel vault, just to remind you, the groin vault, the 2 barrel vaults intersecting, and then here is our rib vault, and there is the fan vault, purely decorative, no structural use. But just as the French loved their height, the English loved their decoration. We go now to Ely Cathedral, and Ely Cathedral is right here. And it is in the city of Ely and pronounced as Ely. It's near Cambridge, and it's the next stage in English Gothic, which is decorated Gothic towards the end of the 13th century, and it will last for 100 years until the end of the 14th century, right there. And here are the 2 images of the interior. It is decorated Gothic. It was built originally in monumental Romanesque, but then parts of the cathedral were rebuilt in an exuberant decorated Gothic. The most notable feature is the central octagonal tower with this kind of lantern. Here it is, that's the tower. And then the beautiful decorated vault, and then the galleries here. So this is all very Romanesque, as you see. The interior is Romanesque, but then parts of it were rebuilt in Gothic. And that's what we're seeing here. This is the tower, is right there, and here we are looking to the building, to the interior from the tower. And here's the exterior of still another cathedral called Exeter Cathedral. And it is a fine example of decorated Gothic with a screen facade. In fact, if you stand very close to it, you don't see the top of the cathedral or the 2 Norman towers behind them, which are Romanesque. And so this is the interior of the Exeter Cathedral. It's really just extraordinary. And there's a use of the so-called Lierne rib, and it's a decorative rib that connects other ribs. You don't have to remember the name. And the resulting construction is called Lierne vault or stellar vault because it looks like a star. And here is what's important for the English. York Minster. Art historians sometimes subdivide the decorated Gothic into 2 periods based on the predominant motifs of the design. And the first is the geometric style, which lasted from about the middle of the 13th century to beginning of the 14th century, and then the curvilinear style that became even maybe sort of like flamboyant in France. and it corresponds to the French flamboyant because it's the 14th century. And something like York Minster would have both the geometric and curvilinear, but basically is done in decorated Gothic. And here we have York Minster. We also looked at Salisbury Cathedral, Ely Cathedral, and Canterbury Cathedral. And now we are looking at the fan vaults, which are in Gloucester Cathedral, also 14th century. And they're just spectacular. And yes, I mean, they sort of look like those Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts. Still more, Sherborne Abbey in Dorset. That's already end of the 15th century. By this time, Italy is doing classical architecture, but the north still very much loves Gothic. And these are just various types of fan vaults and decorated vaults, and there are many more than these. A gorgeous chapel in Westminster Abbey, and that's the early 16th century. The father of Henry VIII, and what we see here are the fan vaults that actually begin to look like stalactites. It's just, and this is now the next stage, the last stage of English Gothic, which will be called Perpendicular Gothic, and or just perpendicular. It's a third and final period, and characterized by the emphasis on vertical lines right here. Sometimes called rectilinear also, as you see, and you can see it in the windows. It's very, very beautiful in a very different way from the French Gothic. And here is the vault of the Chapel of Henry VII. Still another example, Tewkesbury Abbey, officially the Church of St. Mary the Virgin. A large, magnificent parish church in a small market town, and founded in 1092 by the Normans. King's College, Cambridge, right here, also spectacular fan vaults, and in a place like Tewkesbury you think, well, that's not very, very high, so it's not too difficult to do, but this is quite high, so it took some scaffolding to do something so spectacular as this. And then the windows, all of that is perpendicular, rectilinear Gothic. Here are the vaults, and here are the windows in perpendicular style, and as I said, it's 15th century. We now go to Venice. Italy never sat comfortably with Gothic, for the most part, except Venice. Venice did, but even in Venice it didn't just come as an innovative new style that everybody was excited about. It had to fight every step of the way. And the great book to read about Venice is John Ruskin's Stones of Venice, but it's very, very large, so there are shortened versions, such as this, that one can read. And according to Ruskin, what happened in Venice, there was always a struggle between earlier conventions and a more contemporary style. And because Venice was this universal town that traded with the entire world, it always adopted various different styles. And he illustrates the idea of adopting Gothic by gradual changes to the arches that occurred to Venice. And he does a really great job at it, but he also shows how it became a very Venetian Gothic, unlike anything else, certainly not French Gothic, not classical Gothic. Here he writes, during the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries, the architecture of Venice seems to have been formed on the same model and is almost identical with that of Cairo under the caliphs, it being quite immaterial whether one chooses to call both Byzantine or both Arabic, the workmen being certainly Byzantine, but forced to the invention of new forms by their Arabian masters, and bringing these forms into use in whatever other parts of the world they were employed. So the influences in Venice, the influences of Arabia or Byzantium in Venice are paramount everywhere. And here's an example of Arabian Windows in Venice. This is a mullion window that I told you about, and a mullion is just a vertical element that separates two windows, two kind of Gothic looking windows, and sometimes it can spill into tracery, into bar tracery, as we had seen. It can be functional, it doesn't have to be, it could be decorative as well. And we discussed the convenience of a pointed arch, because the pointed arch can be as high or as low as an architect wishes it to be, independently of the width of the doorway, because it is not locked into the formula where pi is a constant. So therefore, the wider is the doorway, the larger would have to be the perfect arch right here, because this is the circumference. Whereas with an OG arch, as it's called, OGEE, this is not necessary. These are the development of arches as Ruskin sees them in Venice, and he points to the 5 basic arches. It begins with Romanesque, then it looks more OG, and it develops. Therefore, there are 6 basic styles of arches, and then each row he shows the development of each arch. So this arch, here's the development of this arch. This arch, development of this arch, etc. And perhaps the best example, one of the best examples in Venice of Venetian Gothic is Cadoro. And Cadoro, right here, it was built in the first half of the 15th century, and various orders here overlap. Ruskin loved this building. Here is his own watercolor of the building. It has a long history, and again, once you have your PowerPoint, you can read the history of Cadoro. But the facade is completely a marble facade. But even what we're looking at only hints at its splendor, because certain elements of the facade were in fact covered with gold leaf, and which is why it's called the House of Gold, Cadoro. And then various other parts of the facade were covered in lapis lazuli, again very, very expensive, cobalt, and other colors. So we can't even imagine what it looked like. All of this crenellation was covered in gold. Here is the design of the front. And well, Venice with its buildings, and very many buildings then were built to emulate Cadoro, and its play of the arches and play of light, and the light as reflects from the sun on the water, then against the arches, then against the darks and the lights. It's spectacular. Here it is again, next to a Renaissance building, a later building. At some point, the Russian Duke gave it to an Italian ballerina, his lover, but she completely destroyed the building, sold a lot of the interior furniture. But fortunately, the man who bought the building after her restored as much as possible. So it's beautiful, and you're looking at it. Restored the staircase too. Another spectacular building in Venice is the Palace of the Duke, the Doge's Palace, right here. And if ducal palaces throughout the world pretty much are fortresses, because they're always worried about something, they're always worried about assault. This is a completely open palace that invites, in fact, people to walk in its loggias right there. And it looks, because the mass of the building is placed on top, it seems at certain times as if essentially floats in the air. The Ruskin called it the central building of the world. It was rebuilt by a variety of architects. The original building was a Byzantine palace, but it was completely destroyed and then replaced with the Gothic building. The facade, as you see, was done in the 14th century, and you can see what's meant by the top of the building literally floating over the water. Here it is, and Canaletto was an 18th century painter, Venetian painter, who painted these beautiful scenes of Venice, of the Grand Canal, and of the Ducal Palace. Here is also, this one is another one by Canaletto, San Marco. San Marco is the Cathedral of Venice, a Byzantine cathedral, and then the square in front. And then there's a little piazzetta. This is the piazza, the large square, and the little piazzetta that goes towards the lagoon. This is Ruskin's own sketch that he did at the age of 16. So as you can see, he was fascinated already then by the building. An interesting building is the Milan Cathedral, and as I said, Italy did not take easily to Gothic. And when you look at the Milan Cathedral, especially the facade is actually a 19th century facade. It was begun at the end of the 14th century, the Milan Cathedral, and as you see, it was done more or less in the French fashion with great open windows right here. But the facade, you can see the influence of Renaissance, because when you look at these windows with the pedimented windows throughout, they're completely Renaissance, but they are overlapped with the screen, which does appear to be very Gothic. Here is the facade. The cathedral itself began in the 14th, facade early 19th century, and here you see these very Renaissance windows. This is what it looked like in the 18th century. Many Italian churches acquired the facade only in the 19th century, the Florence Cathedral, for instance, also. Here the flank buttresses are up there on the roof, and one can actually go and take a tour on the roof. Careful. And here are the roof sculptures, which are quite spectacular. And each pinnacle is crowned with a very large sculpture. Siena Cathedral is probably one of the most glorious cathedrals the world over. It's absolutely spectacular, but also only Gothic details are used, such as the pointed arch. I mean, the Italians loved their walls. They kept them cool in the summer, they kept them warm in the winter, and then they could fresco them. They didn't care for stained glass windows. They cared for the wall. And here it is. It's decorated in this very extraordinary stripe that we had already seen in Florence. Siena is not far from Florence, and it has mosaic in the front. Giovanni Pisano was the designer of the facade right here, and it's a very busy facade, but essentially, just as we saw with San Miniato, we see a square, a solid square at the bottom, and then another church-like building on the top. Here it is. Here's the Siena Cathedral. There's the mosaic right there. Actually, Surget's original Saint-Denis also had a mosaic, I think, on the north pediment. But here are the mosaics, and then sculpture everywhere. A close-up. Here are the sculpture. A lot of this sculpture is in a museum nearby, so you can see the originals with the very, very long necks, like this here. We don't see them as long, but they are in fact very long, so that when we look at them from bottom up, we can just see the face right there. And here are their gargoyles. More of the same. And here is the inside of the cathedral. You get dizzy. It's just so very beautiful. The floors were done later, and they were done in marble intarsia, which is, it's not a mosaic. It's pieces of marble are, well, one essentially creates a vision with colored marble, and it is spectacular. It looks like a painting, and this in particular, it has perspective because these were done already during the Renaissance era. And here are various views of the cathedral. It has an extremely tall naval arcade, as you see, and clerestory windows, and never mind galleries and triforiums. Lorenzo Montani did the Orvieto Cathedral, which is similar to Siena but more restrained, sort of Paris Cathedral compared to Laon Cathedral, and same is here. Here is the front. There's a lot more mosaic, but a lot less of dramatic sculpture. But the same thing. There is a basic square and then another one on top. And the inside also is somewhat less dramatic, but still very beautiful. And here's Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. This is now more of civil architecture, where Gothic also found way into the civil architecture. And mullioned windows right there. And this one is built as a fortress because to protect the governors of Florence from multiple uprisings. This is the Cathedral of Florence. The cathedral, the first stone was laid in 1296, but it will really not be completed for 150 years. The Duomo itself will be completed by Brunelleschi in the middle of the 15th century, and here too the facade was done in the 19th century. It's very large. There's clerestory, there's a little catwalk here, no gallery, no triforium, none of that. And again, just the Gothic arches with the pointed arches are borrowed from the Gothic style, but otherwise there is nothing of classical French design. There's the transept is this, but it actually serves as sort of part of the eastern end of the cathedral, and done in the double-colored stone right here. The dome itself, the cathedral stood for a long time without the dome, but then fortunately an architect appeared who could do it, and his name is Brunelleschi. He really belongs to the Renaissance, even though his dome still appears Gothic, but he had to because the structure itself had Gothic elements, so he had to follow the ribs here because the opening was an octagonal opening, but the idea of the design of the dome is completely Renaissance because he built it with minimum scaffolding and with absolutely brilliant design. Here it is, and here is Brunelleschi, to whom the sculpture is erected as he is looking at his own dome in Florence. And there's a model, there's a wooden model of the cathedral, of the dome of the cathedral, because it's done with two shells, and there is the interior brick shell and then the exterior shell, and the two of them tied up together with buttresses. The buttresses are holding them together. It's quite ingenious. There's a book called Brunelleschi Dome that describes the process. Then the lantern is designed by Brunelleschi, and it's mostly Renaissance already, with Renaissance shells and Renaissance scrolls. So again, it's a combination of styles. There aren't all that many private homes done in Gothic style, which is why the House of Jaques in Bourges is so wonderful and so precious. He was a very wealthy man, and in the mid-15th century, then he fell from power. But before that happened, he built this astonishing house, and the sculpture on it is also quite amazing. I mean, here's one of them of a lady of the house. The sculpture of the lady of the house, as if coming out onto the balcony. The house in general has a lot of sculpture. And then the symbols of the owner everywhere, because he's Jacques Coeur, so Jacques has a shell, as in Saint Jacques de Compostela, and then Coeur is a heart, so there's an image of a heart, and it's repeated everywhere. Still another brilliant medieval place is the Carcassonne in the south of France on the way to Spain, and it is a medieval town, very much medieval town. And here are the walls. It was restored by Viollet-le-Duc in the middle of the 19th century. Viollet-le-Duc was an engineer and architect specializing in Gothic structures, and he went all around France, making notes, making schematics, restoring places. And here's Carcassonne. In England, well, there are many palaces in England, including Hurstmonceux Castle, which is in East Sussex, right here. Still another in England is Warwick Castle, which actually originally was built by William the Conqueror, but then of course rebuilt many times. The Feathers Inn, the Feathers Hotel in Shropshire, which is described as a prodigy of Tudor architecture. Tudors lingered with medieval arts because Henry VIII broke with Catholicism, he broke with Rome. As a result, they did not invite architects from Rome, they did not welcome the Renaissance until considerably later. So under Henry VIII and under Elizabeth, there was still this lingering back in times medieval. A spectacular place is a town hall in Louvain in Belgium, and that's done in Gothic style in the 15th century. And finally, last but not least, is the House of Parliament, the Houses of Parliament in England that were built in the 19th century under a horrible fire in 1834 that happened there. The only buildings that survived were Westminster Hall, the cloisters of St. Stephen's, and the Chapel of St. Mary Undercroft, and the Jewel Tower. But everything else was burnt, and a competition was announced as a result of which one architect, Charles Berry, he won the competition for the new buildings in the Gothic revival style. 19th century was great with Gothic revival. Well, look at Princeton, look at Yale, and specifically inspired by the English Perpendicular style. And then in that, he was actually assisted by Augustus Pugin, who was specifically a revival Gothic architect, because Charles Berry was actually a classicist, and you can see the classical undertones. I mean, there's a great deal of symmetry there. But then again, Gothic cathedrals had a great deal of symmetry as well. I mean, if one thinks of the Notre Dame in Paris. So, well, the two of them did the building, and Pugin specifically did the interiors. And, well, they're very, very Gothic. About 20 years ago, there was a Gothic building built on Princeton campus on the site of the old tennis courts. So Gothic very much continues in all sorts of variants. France, without question, has the purest Gothic. And then something like the Cologne Cathedral, German cathedrals inherited the French ideals, but the moment Gothic went elsewhere, such as Italy or England, other countries applied their own standards, but were very happy to borrow the lovely stylizations of Gothic. Thus, we have come to the end of our course. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, and have a great summer.